Okay. Um, Hello, everybody. I'm Tammy Gaskell. I'm the director of the Rojan Library and the chair of the Columbia County Libraries Association. And tonight we have Jeff Urbin from the Roosevelt Presidential Library and Museum with us to talk about Eleanor Roosevelt and Eleanor Roosevelt, tireless advocate for change, a very appropriate topic for this Women's History Month. We still have a few more people joining in, and we are recording this. So if you come in late, you will be able to view it a little bit later. We'll have it up on the Columbia County Libraries Association website later this week. But for now, I'm just going to turn it over to Jeff. If you do have questions, please put them in the Q&A, and we will address them at the end of the presentation. Thanks, Jeff.
Okay, great. Thank you and welcome everybody. Thanks for being inside and watching me tonight. It's a beautiful evening out there. I was afraid people might be sitting on their porch having a glass of wine, but we've got important stuff to talk about here, so I'm glad you all joined me. Tonight we're talking about Eleanor Roosevelt, a tireless advocate for change. And I got to tell you, Eleanor Roosevelt is one of my favorite women of all time and one of my favorite people of the 20th century. Right up there with Frances Perkins, my mom, and my wife. So those are the top four, and Eleanor of the 20th century for me. And it's always a pleasure to talk about her because she's just such an inspiring person and such a role model for just keep on going. And, something gets you down, you just push on through and you find a way to make what it is that you want to have happen. And that's exactly what Mrs. Roosevelt did for her entire life. Now, tonight, what I'm going to want to do is talk a little bit about her upbringing, how she grew up, and then talk about some turning points in her life where she learned very valuable lessons, and then talk about some of the techniques that she used while she was accomplishing so much that she accomplished in her life. So Eleanor is known around the world in her own time and in our time as a champion of social justice and human rights. And she continues to be an inspiration to people even to this day. I mean, we're now nearly 60 years past when she passed away. And, I work with thousands, tens of thousands of students around the country and around the world. And Mrs. Roosevelt is still a constant topic of research for not just young girls, but also young boys as well, because she's just such a champion of making things happen and doing the right thing. So tonight we're going to talk about some of the turning points, and we'll draw some conclusions out from there. But let's talk about her background and growing up first. So her actual name is Anna Eleanor Roosevelt, but she went by Eleanor, and she was born in New York City on October 11th in 1884. And her mother was Anna Hall. She was named after her mother. And she was part of the Livingston clan, her mom was. And her father was Elliot Roosevelt, who was Teddy Roosevelt's baby brother. And he was part, of course, of the Oyster Bay Roosevelt clan down there in Long Island. And her mother, when she was born, when Eleanor was born, didn't think she was a particularly attractive baby. Her mother was beautiful. Her mother was, little, Miss New York socialite, all fancy and connected and all that sort of stuff. And when Eleanor was born, she was kind of a disappointment to her mom. So much so, in fact, that as Eleanor grew into a toddler, her mother nicknamed her Granny. Granny because she thought she reminded her mother of a little old lady in the way she looked, in her mannerisms, and the way she behaved. Now, you don't have to be a child psychologist to know that this is name calling, right? And it's going to have a negative impact on somebody's self-esteem, and that's exactly what happened with her mom. Her dad was a neglective alcoholic. What I mean by that is he would get drunk and then he would just completely forget Eleanor. He would completely forget everything except the bottle. And probably the saddest, but most, you know, illustrative story of this is one time he promised her they were going to do a daddy-daughter day in New York. Daddy-daughter day, you and me, Eleanor, whatever you want to do, we're going to go out there, we're going to make it happen. And the big day came, and Eleanor's got visions of, you know, going to Central Park and seeing a show and a fancy dinner and all these sorts of things. And the very first place her father goes is to a hotel, first thing in the morning. He's known there. He goes in. He goes into the bar and he becomes drunk. And Eleanor sits out on the front stoop for almost an hour and a half, waiting for her dad to come out. Finally, she pulls up, you know, gets enough courage to tug on the doorman's jacket and say, "Hey, my dad went in here, quite a while ago. He said he had to go to a meeting, but he hasn't come out." And they said, "Well, you know, he's been sent home out the back. You know, he got drunk, and rather than have him stumble out here into the street, look bad for the hotel, look bad for him, we sent him out back home in a taxi." So this is the kind of upbringing that she has. Now, here is a picture of her and her dad. And I don't know about you, but I think, you know, she's a perfectly cute little kid right there, right? There's nothing wrong with that kid. She doesn't look like a little old lady to me. The bangs are maybe a bit severe, right? But other than that, she's a perfectly lovely child. But her mother called her Granny, and that was the relationship that they had. Now, by the time Eleanor was about 10 or 11 years old, both her parents had died. Her mother from diphtheria and her father from complications with alcoholism. And so she ended up in Tivoli, New York, just up here in the northern part of Dutchess County. And Grandma Hall ran a very tight ship in her house. And she was very strict. She believed that music should only be sung on Sunday because it was a gift from God. And she had two alcoholic sons that lived there with her. Alcoholism ran in the family. And in both sides of the family, actually. And young Eleanor was there with Grandma Hall, and Grandma Hall would not abuse Eleanor, but she wasn't very nice to her. So if Eleanor was asked to set the table and put the knives on the wrong side or the forks on the wrong side, then her grandmother would fly into a rage and say, "Eleanor, we've been over this so many times. You know, how can you not remember this? You know, this is the way it goes." And then she would give her the cold shoulder for 3 or 4 days, not talk to her. And there weren't a lot of other kids or anybody around. So, Eleanor was pretty lonely in terms of that. Her two uncles would literally shoot at her with rifles from the attic windows. They would get drunk in the afternoon. They would go up to the attic. They'd open the windows. And if Eleanor was at the potting barn, let's say potting, pots and flowers, then when she went to get the next one, they would shoot the one that she just did just to see her jump. Or if she were out with her pony and brought the pony back and was brushing him down and getting him cooled down after the ride, they might shoot into the bale of hay that the pony was eating from, just to scare her and just to scare the pony. And they thought this was hilarious. Now, this brings us to the first turning point. When Eleanor Roosevelt is 15 years old, Grandma Hall says, "Listen, this is not working here, right? We got these alcoholic uncles. This is not a good situation." So she ends up packing up Eleanor and she sends her over to a place called Allenwood School over in England, just outside of London. And there she meets this woman. And this woman is a woman by the name of Madame Silvestri. And Madame Silvestri is the headmistress of the school. And she sees in Eleanor, she's the first person to see in Eleanor the things that other people are going to see and the rest of the world will come to know. So she's the first person who see in Eleanor how smart she is, how compassionate she is, how kind she is, and how inquisitive she can be. And Madame Silvestri encourages her to be all of those things and to do all of those things. And she says, you should travel, you should write about what you are interested in. And she's so impressed by Eleanor that she'll even allow Eleanor to go into town, into London, without an escort. Right? You can take care of yourself. You know how to handle yourself. You can do that. And one day she's in there and she bumps into in London, and she bumps into a distant aunt of hers who reports back to Grandma Hall that Eleanor is trouncing around London without an escort. And they almost bring her back, right? If it hadn't been for Madame Silvestri stepping in and saying, "Listen, she's really making a lot of progress here. I won't let that happen again. Sorry about that." And she was able to stay for the whole 3 years. And it's at this point that she reaches her first turning point. Madame Silvestri taps into and shows an interest in her for the first time in her life. Someone has done this, right? Other than, superficially, like, her dad. And so Madame Silvestri is a huge influence, and Eleanor keeps a picture of Madame Silvestri on her desk for the rest of her life. That's how instrumental she was, and they remain friends for the rest of her life, or rest of their lives. And from her time with Madame Silvestri, she learns the skills of some confidence and some self-awareness and some self-value and some self-worth. I'm not a little old lady. I'm not a granny. I am a young woman who has ideas. I am a young woman who has interests. I am a young woman who has things to offer the world. Madame Silvestri has shown me that, and she begins to come out of her shell a bit there. After 3 years at Allenwood School, she graduates and she comes back to New York. She moves into New York City with an aunt, and she begins to work at a tenement house in New York City as a social worker, right? Basically tending to the needs of the immigrant women there in the tenement. And while she's there, she meets a guy by the name of Franklin Roosevelt. Now, I should say she re-meets a guy by the name of Franklin Roosevelt. Franklin and Eleanor Roosevelt first met when he was 4 and she was 2. And they met at the estate here in Hyde Park. And they were distant cousins, and the Roosevelts had these big family reunions all the time. And so they first met when he was 4 and she was 2. And then they had kind of kept in touch a little bit here and there throughout the years, but they hadn't seen each other in 3 years because Eleanor was in England. And when they reunite, when they reconnect, sparks fly. Okay, sparks fly. It's exactly what you would want in a young couple in love. Lots been made of the marriage being, a partnership and kind of was a scam and all these sorts of things. No, it was definitely a partnership. But when it first began, it was based upon a deep, deep mutual love. I would go so far as to describe Franklin and Eleanor as two halves of the same whole. Right? Whereas she was kind of bookish and shy and timid, and he was sort of outgoing and, over the top. He would help bring her up a bit, and she would help bring him down a bit. And they were really quite a perfect pair. On March 17th, 1905, they get married in New York City, St. Patrick's Day. And that's because that happens to be the only day that Uncle Teddy, her favorite uncle, is able to walk her down the aisle because her father has passed away by this point. And Uncle Teddy says, "Well, I'm going to be in town for the St. Patrick's Day parade. I'll swing over, walk you down the aisle, and we'll go from there." And she later says that this was one of the biggest mistakes she ever made, because on her wedding day, she ended up playing a bit part in the wedding. Everybody was paying attention to Uncle Teddy, the larger than life president of the United States. And so he inadvertently stole away all the attention on her wedding day. Roosevelts went to Europe for 3 months on a honeymoon. They came back and they began a family. They ended up having 6 children, 5 of which lived to be adults. Franklin Jr. the first died within 1 year of his birth. And so from around about 1906 to 1912, I'm sorry, 1906 to 1916, Eleanor Roosevelt was either pregnant or was just getting over being pregnant, and she had this house full of 5 kids there as well. Now, she was a very timid mother. She didn't have a good role model as a mother, and so she was very timid about the children. And Sarah, Franklin's mother, stepped in and took over a lot of the lion's share of raising the kids. And then in World War I, Franklin Roosevelt is appointed to be the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And what that means is that he moves away from his home here in Hyde Park, and he goes to Washington, D.C., and he becomes the Assistant Secretary of the Navy. And Eleanor Roosevelt begins to volunteer with the Red Cross, and she's making friends with some of the other secretaries' wives, and she's really beginning to create a little social network for herself. But there's a terrible tragedy in the marriage, and that is that Franklin cheats on her. So one of the parts of the Assistant Secretary of the Navy job is to travel around the world and visit all the Navy bases, right? Make sure the Navy's doing what it's supposed to do everywhere around the world. The other part of the job is to go to all the after hours meetings and parties and social events to rub elbows with all the mucky mucks in Washington, D.C. And Eleanor didn't like to do this, right? Very often there was cocktails served at these things. She didn't like to be around alcohol. She was still pretty shy, pretty timid, and she was exhausted from raising 5 kids. So finally she said to Franklin, listen, I can't go anymore. You gotta go with somebody else. And he says, well, who could I possibly go with? And she says, how about my social secretary, Lucy Mercer? So Eleanor gives up going to these parties, and Franklin begins to go with Lucy Mercer, and they end up having an affair. Eleanor finds out about it by finding love letters that Lucy Mercer has written to Franklin Roosevelt, and she says she felt as if the bottom fell out of her world, right? So this is where the two halves of the same whole, the perfect lovey-dovey couple, begins to break into really more like two pistons working in the same engine, working together, getting the job done, but not that same connection as there had been. So this becomes the second turning point in Eleanor's life, because she goes to Franklin and she says, listen, if you love this woman as much as these letters seem to say, you need to be with her, not with me. I offer you a divorce. And Franklin said no. And he said no for 2 reasons. Number one, his political advisor, Louis Howe, said, you can't get divorced. If you get divorced, your political career is over, right? You can't run a family. How are you going to run a state? How are you going to run a country? How are you going to run an agency? You got to stay together. And the more important reason was his mother said to him, Franklin, you found Eleanor, you fell in love with Eleanor, you married Eleanor, you cheated on Eleanor. Now you need to make it right. And if you don't, and there's a divorce, I am cutting you off from the Roosevelt family fortune. So Sarah maintained the Roosevelt family fortune until she died in 1941, and then Franklin got the fortune from there, and he was only alive until now 1945. So at this point, they decide to stay in the marriage, but it gives Eleanor a lot of leverage and a lot of independence in the marriage, right? She's freed of the emotional support she has to have for her husband. Now it is simply more of that partnership idea. And she begins to go out and do things on her own. She begins to go to her own meetings. She begins to join organizations. And anytime Franklin tries to, reel her in and say, hey, shouldn't you be home with the kids, or shouldn't you be home, tending to your husband? She simply says, hey, you know what? You're the one that cheated on me. We wouldn't even have a marriage if it weren't for me sticking with you. And you wouldn't have a political career if it weren't for me sticking with you. So back off. And this is the way she gains leverage in the marriage, and also a sense of independence. So that's her second, turning point. The first is meeting Madame Silvestri. The second is the affair. And please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that the affair was a good thing. It turned out to be, she took the grapes and she made it into a lovely wine, which was the sense of independence and the sense of of freedom and leverage in the marriage. I don't mean that in any way to minimize what happened. And Franklin should not have, in my opinion, should not have cheated on her, and yet he did. So I'm not trying to just make a silver lining out of this, but there was a silver lining in there. So Franklin continues his political career. In 1921, he contracts polio, and he returns to Hyde Park and spends the next 7 years trying to learn how to walk again. And this is an important turning point once again for Eleanor, because Franklin wants to have a political career. He wants to keep his name out there in political circles, but he's unable to do it because he can't walk. Right? He's got to stay home and learn how to walk again. And so what he does is he sends Eleanor out in his place. So Eleanor Roosevelt travels all across the state. She travels all across the country. She's making speeches for him. She is writing letters. She is writing articles. She's making public appearances, the whole time keeping Franklin's name still in Democratic politics in the state and also in the country. So it's at this point, another turning point, that Eleanor begins to develop her political skills. She begins to develop a network. Because she's traveling all around the state, because she's traveling all around the country, she's making connections with literally tens of thousands of people, many of which are going to be able to help her in her career as she moves along. She's developing her writing skills by writing all these articles and these speeches and these letters. She's developing her public speaking skills because she knew she had that high sort of, crackly voice and wasn't always well received. So she made her speeches tight and concise. So she got up there, said what she had to say, and then got out of the way. And Louis Howe, the same guy who had told Franklin, you cannot get divorced or your political career is over, became something of an advisor to Eleanor as well. And he coached her in, here's how you talk to these guys. Here's what you do with these guys. Here's the way you give the speech. Here's how you appear on the radio. Here's how you appear in public. And he gave her a lot of coaching and a lot of things along those ways. And so when Franklin Roosevelt returns in 1928 to politics, he ends up getting elected to be the governor of the state of New York, and he has Eleanor to thank in large measure for that, because no one has forgotten him. She's been out there talking as if he was still, perfectly viable. He's just, at home in Hyde Park, and he's able to win the governorship, which he then uses as a stepping stone to the actual presidency. And that's exactly what he does. He runs for president in 1932 and he wins. And Eleanor Roosevelt is not happy about that. She understands he wants a political career, but now she understands, oh my God, if he wins, I'm going to be First Lady of the United States. That's a lot of pressure. That's a lot of, living in the fishbowl. And she's not happy about it. But she understands this was Franklin's goal. This was his dream. We both have been kind of working for this. And so she decides, okay, I'll do it. Okay, I'm going to do it. But what she does is she does it on her own terms. So she says, I am not only going to have to be First Lady, but what I'm going to do is I'm going to reinvent the role in my own image. And one of the first things she does is she allows first of all, the first thing she does is she gives press conferences. No other First Lady had ever done that before. And then she allows only female reporters to come to her press conferences. And the reason she does that is that only male reporters are allowed to go to Franklin's. So she says, that's not fair. I'm going to give women the opportunity to talk with me. And, if you're going to play it that way, we're going to play it this way. And this was a huge boost for women in journalism, because we're talking about the Great Depression, and the first people fired generally were women. So if you were a newspaper and you wanted to cover Eleanor Roosevelt, you had to have at least one woman on your staff if you want to get that information, if you want to get that scoop, if you want to go to those press conferences. And this becomes yet another turning point. By creating the job of First Lady in her own manner, in her own image, and in the way that she wants to handle this, she basically takes a ceremonial job, and she makes it a real job. And she begins to use her access to the president. This is what she gets in this turning point: political access to the president of the United States. Not just any president of the United States, but a president who will hold that office for 12 years. So you've got a long horizon of making changes, a long horizon of pushing for things. And he is an activist president. He's a guy that wants to get things done. He's a guy that doesn't mind experimenting. He's a guy that's open to ideas. And so Eleanor Roosevelt becomes that partner in feeding him ideas, in feeding him information, and in being a feedback loop to him from what she hears from other people. So she is the first, as I said, first lady to hold her own press conferences. And she travels 144,000 miles her first year as first lady, right? So she travels all across the country, and she becomes the president's eyes, ears, and legs. So she goes out, and because he can't, he's got the burden of office and also the inability to travel well because of the polio. She travels 144,000 miles. And she goes back and she's visiting many of these people that she had built up that network with. And she's talking to people in communities, and she's talking to people where they are. Here's a political cartoon. It says, "For gosh sakes, here comes Mrs. Roosevelt." So she wasn't afraid. These are two men in a mine, right down in a mining operation there. And she goes and she visits people where they are. She talks to them. She interviews them, basically. Franklin says to her, "Listen, when you go out there and you visit a soup kitchen and they tell you that they're serving gumbo, stick your nose in the pot and make sure it's not oatmeal, because we're not paying for oatmeal. We're paying for gumbo." And so that's exactly what she did. And she started to write a My Day column. And she wrote that from 1935 to 1962. Just a few weeks up before she died, she continued to write her My Day column. And some people called it the world's first blog, because she would simply write about whatever it was that she felt was going on, or whatever, about how she felt what was going on and what was going on. So, she might say, "Well, today I went into Poughkeepsie and I bought some tomatoes. And the beefy boys were the best. Boy, they were lovely. I had a lovely lunch with those." Then the next day, she's visiting an ambassador's wife. "Oh, spoke with the ambassador's wife, and the people of her country are having this problem or that problem." So whatever it was that was on her plate was on her mind and was on out there in her her My Day columns. She also had news columns that she did in various papers like Callers, Ladies Home Journal, those sorts of things. She also held Franklin's feet to the fire on social issues. So if she didn't think he was moving far enough on something, she would say something like, "Franklin, I was speaking to people the other day and they said that they really need to," and she would push him, and he'd be like, "Oh, okay, I'll see what I can do. I'll see what I can do." That's the kind of relationship that they had. She traveled to England twice during the World War, which was a huge boost for morale for the British. Right here they are, 30 miles off the coast of Nazi-occupied Europe, and here's the first lady, right, walking around London, walking around, the village square, walking around the, town, showing people that, hey, I'm not afraid to be here, right? I know we got Hitler 30 miles away, but we're doing so well in this war. Franklin, feels that this is a good place for me to be. She also traveled to the South Pacific, and she traveled 30,000 miles. Here is a picture of her, and she is meeting with various sailors out there in the Pacific. And this was a huge boost to morale out in the Pacific. In fact, she traveled 30,000 miles and she lost 30 pounds on the trip. It was about 6 weeks because she traveled all around. It's estimated that she was seen by about 150,000 troops and sailors while she was out there. And this again gave them the sense of, hey, I'm out here in the middle of nowhere, but my God, there's the first lady, right? So, we must be making progress. We must be pretty safe where we are. Otherwise, they wouldn't be sending the first lady out here. She took a stand on civil rights, and two important places that occurred was the first was with Marian Anderson. And Marian Anderson was an African American opera singer, and she was supposed to sing at a concert at Constitution Hall in Washington, D.C., but they wouldn't let her because she was Black. And she happened to be friends with Mrs. Roosevelt, and Mrs. Roosevelt said, well, gee, what do you mean, how's that concert going? And she said, well, I'm not going to be able to sing there because I'm Black. And Mrs. Roosevelt said, what do you mean you're Black? A voice, doesn't have a color. It doesn't have, it has a tone. It has a vibrance, but it has no color. What do you mean they're not going to let you sing? And the people that were running that concert were none other than the DAR, the Daughters of the American Revolution. Mrs. Roosevelt happened to be a member of that, and when she found out that they were running the concert, she resigned her membership in protest. And it created a huge hullabaloo and brought a lot of attention to the fact that African Americans were not being treated fairly or equally. And so what this did was it led 6 weeks later on Easter Sunday to a concert on the steps of the Lincoln Memorial, and 75,000 people were at that concert. Constitution Hall holds about 2,000 people. Marian Anderson had a concert on the steps of Lincoln Hall, or Lincoln Memorial, and 75,000 people attended. But one very important person did not attend, and that was none other than Eleanor Roosevelt. Now you would think, wait a minute, I thought they were friends. Didn't she resign her membership in protest? Yes, she did. But when she was invited to the concert, Mrs. Roosevelt said, no, thank you, I'm not going to attend. And the reason she did that was she remembered back to her wedding day on March 17th, 1905, when the big celebrity showed up at her wedding and she was pushed aside and playing just a small part. Mrs. Roosevelt knew that if she went to that concert, the newsreels would be Mrs. Roosevelt attends conference or concert for African American women, right? So she wanted Marian Anderson to have her moment in the sun. And I get goosebumps, literally get goosebumps when I tell that story, because that is my favorite story of Eleanor Roosevelt. That says who she is. She remembers from March 17th, 1905, a lesson that she's learned in her life, and she applies it on Easter Sunday, 1939. And this is the kind of thing that she did over and over and over again. She heard about a group of African American pilots who were learning how to fly during World War II, the Tuskegee Airmen. African Americans who were being told that, sorry, you're not qualified to be a pilot, you're not qualified to do this. But they said, well, let's give them a little chance and we'll see what they can do. Mrs. Roosevelt hears about this. She goes down and she flies with Chief Anderson. This is Chief Anderson, the top African American pilot who was training the rest of the Tuskegee Airmen. You can see she flies with him. She is absolutely delighted when she lands, when she gets down. And the Secret Service was like, oh my God, she's flying with these African American pilots. That's not good. But she gets down, she lands, she says, you know what? These fellows can fly just as well as anyone. And she knew flying because she happened to be close personal friends with none other than Amelia Earhart. And she would sometimes fly with her. So she knew good flying when she saw it. And that endorsement of the Tuskegee Airmen made a real impact on getting them the support that they needed, and the work and such that was going in to now support them, which hadn't been there prior to her helping out. Randolph, there was a march that was planned for Washington. A. Philip Randolph and Walter White were planning this march on Washington, D.C. to be in favor of allowing more integration into the military. And President Roosevelt found out about this, and he found out that they were planning on having 100,000 protesters in Washington during the war to protest the way that African Americans were not being included in the military. So Franklin sends Eleanor up to New York, where they're planning this march, and he says, "You got to talk them out of it. You got to talk them out of it." And she goes up there and she says, "You know, you guys, the president doesn't want you to have this march." And they said, "Well, Miss Roosevelt, we feel it's really important and we're going to go ahead and do it." And she said, "Oh, all right, I tried." Right. So she goes back to Franklin and says, "Oh, they're pretty serious about it. So, you need to do something." And so what he does is he issues Executive Order 8802, which is the executive order that desegregated the defense industries. And this is enough for these civil rights leaders to postpone. They postponed the march, saying, "Okay, that's a good first step. Maybe we don't have to march right now. We'll keep that for later on." So Mrs. Roosevelt was in the middle of all this, and President Roosevelt felt he could have her talk them out of it. She really had no intention of talking them out of it. And so she said, "Well, best I could do." And this is what comes from that and is led from there. During World War II, we had Japanese American incarceration. And this was, of course, when people of Japanese ancestry on the West Coast were rounded up and put in incarceration camps, about 120,000. Mrs. Roosevelt spoke out about it publicly, and the president called her and said, "Eleanor, you can't be doing that, right? We got a two-front war here. You can't talk about this in public." And so Eleanor says, "Okay, I won't talk about it in public." And she then goes behind the scenes and she begins to work trying to bring help to the 120,000 Japanese Americans who are in these incarceration camps. She works for furloughs for young women that are of college age to get out of the camps and go to colleges on the East Coast and in the North, where there's less anti-Asian animosity. And she advocates for the young men to be able to join the army or go out and the older men work in factories in towns near some of these camps on work furloughs each day. And she begins to make conditions better for the folks there in the internment camps as well. Now, in 1940, she goes to this is the third time that President Roosevelt is running for re-election, and she goes to the convention to give a speech. But before she goes to the convention, she says, "Well, I want to take a look at the list of delegates." And they give her the list of delegates, and she realizes there's very, very few women, mostly men. So she says, "Well, you know what? I don't think I'm going to go. I'd like to see more women on that." And so they got more women delegates. Then she goes to the convention and she places Franklin Roosevelt's name in nomination for running for the third time. And she makes this case and she says, ordinarily, you shouldn't run for a third term. There's, we have a long tradition of 2 terms for a president, blah, 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 blah. And she says, but that would be under ordinary times. And these are no ordinary times. And then she lays out the argument as to why President Roosevelt should be renominated and should be reelected. So he allows her to go there and puts her in the spotlight, right? Now this is a pinnacle in her career because wow, she's nominating this guy, she's making the case for him to run for a third term. Nobody had ever successfully done that before, and she did, and he won. So by getting more women delegates into the party, she helped to pave the way down the road, not immediately, but down the road, for people like Barbara Boxer and Christine Whitman and Geraldine Ferraro and Madeleine Albright and Elizabeth Dole and Bella Abzug and Hillary Clinton and AOC and Kamala Harris. And the list goes on and on. She helped to bring women into the Democratic Party. And then comes the 5th turning point. And the 5th turning point is on April 12th, 1945, when President Roosevelt dies. President Roosevelt has a cerebral hemorrhage, a stroke in Warm Springs, Georgia, and he dies. And Mrs. Roosevelt says, the story is over. And it was for about a week and a half. And then she got right back out there and she realized, wow, you know what? Now, without Franklin being president, right? I spent 12 years with all that influence in office, but she always had to be worried about doing too much wrong that might hurt him politically. Now, without that, she was free. She was now able to pursue her own mission and cast her own shadow. And Harry Truman appointed her. Where did Harry Truman picture go? Oh, Harry Truman appointed her to be on the U.S. delegation to the United Nations. And there she is with Harry Truman, a couple of young Girl Scouts, and the United Nations flag. And while she's at the United Nations, she helps to draft the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is unanimously passed in 1948 and lays down the foundation for what it means to be a person, right? What is personhood? Human rights for every person, not just men, not just women, not just people of certain varieties or types, but everybody. What does it mean to have human rights? And they passed the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Here's a political cartoon where it shows Eleanor, and she's got her little farmer pants on, and she's watering the Human Rights Commission as a little tree so that this will continue to grow and continue to be an important part. And it's the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which she was the chairperson of, and it took 2 years to put that together. There are 30 rights that we all have as human beings, and it's codified in the United Nations. Now, there's certainly been many violations of it over the years and all that. But what it does is it puts on record what is and isn't correct, what is and isn't right in terms of what governments are able to do. And it lays out specific rights to education, to marriage, to, having a country, to being able to move to other countries and various other things. That she's able to push forth. She becomes a bit of a kingmaker. In 1960, John Kennedy comes to Hyde Park to give a speech about Social Security, and he's really here to get Eleanor Roosevelt's endorsement for the presidency because he knows that he needs her endorsement. She has the golden touch. She is the face of democratic politics, and she meets with him in Hyde Park. Now, one of the things that people don't realize is the night before the meeting, her granddaughter is injured in a horseback riding accident up in Utica. And so Mrs. Roosevelt is the closest family member. She gets a state police escort up to Utica, and over the course of the night, the little granddaughter dies. So they bring her back down. Eleanor gets back in the car. She comes back down to Hyde Park, and she keeps her meeting with John F. Kennedy. She says, my granddaughter has died. There's nothing I can do for her here now. Her parents are on the way. They were up in Maine. Her parents are on the way here to collect her body, to be with her. I have to meet with Senator Kennedy. And it's at that meeting the next morning that she holds his feet to the fire for more civil rights legislation in the Democratic platform for 1960. Now, this does not get passed in his administration. He's killed in 1963, but things like the Housing Rights Act, the Voting Rights Act, were all things that she advocated for being in the 1960 Democratic platform, and Lyndon Johnson was able to pass that in 1964 and 65. So in addition to the large and notable contributions we've talked about so far, Mrs. Roosevelt was also a member of the Women's League of Voters, the NAACP. She was first a member and then she was on the board. She was a member of the Consumers League, the Democratic Party at the state and national level. She was part of President Kennedy's Commission on the Status of Women. She was a co-owner of the Todd Hunter School in New York. She was a co-owner of Valkill Industries, which was a little factory that she ran in Hyde Park. She was part of the Women's Trade Union League. And the list goes on and on and on. She did advertising and promoted causes such as hearing aids for elderly folks, the March of Dimes, and the American Cancer Society. And one of the things that she did, if she was going to endorse something or endorse a product, she had a provision in her contract that said she can speak about whatever she wants. So there was a margarine that she was hawking, right? She signed a contract to, speak on behalf of this margarine. And so during one of the first commercials, she says, this margarine, look how easily it spreads across this bread. This margarine spreads so quick and so easily, just like atomic weapons. Now we need to do something about these things before they, right? So, she uses that little part in her contract to speak about whatever it is that she wants to speak about, right? The commercial ran like once. But if you YouTube it, you can probably find it. So she really put her money where her mouth is. She really put her heart into things, and she at every one of these turning points, rather than complain about what was wrong, she picked up where she was and she continued on. Mrs. Roosevelt was what I like to call a futurist, right? She wasn't looking necessarily where she was. She was looking to where she wanted to be. She would see where she was. She would take stock of that. She would understand, what the challenges were, but also she would look for the opportunities. And then she would say, well, here's the world I want there to be. Here's the world that I'm in. And she would begin to build bridges to that. Some of the tools that she used, the techniques and tools, the first one is called moral constructs. So Mrs. Roosevelt would take these enormous issues and she would break them down into a moral construct. Basically, that is a yes or no. Should you do something or shouldn't you do something, right? Like a binary switch. Is it on or is it off? So let's think of a topic. Like let's say you wanted to do feeding children, right? Having food for children. Mrs. Roosevelt would say, well, don't you think we should that every child has the right to have sufficient food so that they're able to concentrate on their studies and do what they need to do in school, right? And who's going to argue with that, right? Who's going to argue that every kid should have, sufficient food to do that? And so whoever she was talking with would say, oh, yes, oh, I totally agree, Mrs. Roosevelt, and then they would come up with all these excuses as why they couldn't do it. It's going to cost so much. Who's going to administer this? How are we going to get the food? The teacher, blah, blah. And, there's always a million reasons of why you can't do something. But then she would say, whoa, didn't we just say that you thought this was a good idea? Didn't you just say that this is something we need to do? Then we must find a way to do it, right? And she would just blow through all those arguments because she already had you, right? You had already agreed, yes, something should be done. Now she was going to hold your feet to the fire and make sure that you did it. That's the way Mrs. Roosevelt was. Is it sneaky? I don't think so. It's getting down to the heart of things. And then, what do we really need to accomplish here? And we can have 1,000 reasons why we can't, but we need to find 1,000 reasons why we can. She also used a technique called personification. And this is something that you see a lot of times now in, I think Ronald Reagan kind of brought it back in the State of the Union addresses, right? Mrs. Roosevelt didn't like to speak in terms of statistics. 30% of the farmers, 80% of this, 90% of that, 22% of this. What she would do is, rather than say 30% of the farmers, she would bring in a farm family. And she would say, here is, old MacDonald. He's got a farm. And here is his wife And his children, and that's his little son down there, the kid with the makeup, that's his son, Ronald McDonald. And so he goes on to make a fortune in hamburgers, but that's another story. So she would say, these are the people I'm talking about. And when you're sitting there and you're looking in the face of, old MacDonald, and you can see the lines on his face and the worry on his face, and, the desperation in his wife's face, and the worry and fear in his children's face, it becomes more difficult for you to say no. You can say no to 30%. 30% is a number. It's hard to say no to a human being. And so a lot of times, like with these State of the Union addresses, they're like, oh, fireman of the year, right? And these up there sitting next to the first lady, and they all do it. And the fireman of the year looks just like the guy that lives down the street from you, right? You think that's an accident? No, because what he's trying to do is use personification. Mrs. Roosevelt was a master at that. I'm not going to talk to you about the number of people that are going to, be suffering because of this. I'm going to bring some of them in here and let them tell you the story face to face. She was also, another technique she used was associative circles and cross-pollination. So what I mean by this is, a minute ago, I read you just a short little list of things that Mrs. Roosevelt was involved with. And when Mrs. Roosevelt was involved with something, she was involved with it, right? It wasn't like she was just, a member of the board listed on the, the side of the stationery. If she was involved in something, she'd go to the meetings. If she was involved in something, she'd serve on the committees. And so what she would do is she would get involved in all these variety of things, and then she would look for ways to cross-pollinate. Right? So she'd go to one meeting and they would say, well, we have a surplus of this or that. Oh, you do? That's interesting because I was just at a meeting Thursday where they're in need of some of those things. Why don't you call blah, blah, blah? And she would connect these people up. Now, how was she able to do this? Because she had a network of thousands of people that she had built first while she was keeping Franklin's name alive and then as First Lady. So she knew the movers and the shakers. She knew when somebody needed something over here that somebody else had it over there, and she would make those connections for people and bring those things together so that she was able to make that happen. She also used total media involvement. Mrs. Roosevelt was a media star well before the media became what it is today, right? If she were alive today, she would definitely be an influencer, no doubt about it. And she used the media of her time. She wrote her My Day column, and she wrote about 3,000 of those over the course of her career. She wrote hundreds of articles. She wrote 24 books. She was on the radio. She made public appearances. She was on television. You name it, she was out there. If there was a cause she was supporting, she was out there making it happen. And keep in mind how difficult this was for her. All she had was basically a high school education, right? Allenwood School. She went to the finishing school. She never went on to college. So when she wrote, she felt very self-conscious. I'm not a writer. I'm not I'm not an author. And she was always worried, do I use, a colon, a semicolon, an esophagus? What do I use here? Right. And so she was always very nervous about her writing. She was always very nervous about her public appearances because when she got in front of a crowd, she could hear her mother go ahead, Granny, give the speech, Granny. Go ahead, Granny. The people want to hear you, Granny. Right. So that was going through her mind all the time. When she was on the radio or making a public speech, she understood she had that voice that could sometimes become quite irritating. And so she got up there, she said what she had to say, and then she got the heck out of the way and sat down. And one of the things, I'm going to give you two more, and then we'll open it up some quick questions and answers. One of the things she did was she created an inner oasis for herself. She had this place in her mind and in her heart where she would draw herself in and she would give herself a pep talk. And she would go over, okay, you know what? I can do this. I've written these things. I've given these speeches. I can do it. So she would draw herself into that, build her confidence, and then step out onto the platform, even though she was still worried, even though she was still nervous, because she felt that what she had to say was more important than the fears that she felt. So her inner oasis, if you can build one of those for yourself where you can go in there and be your own cheerleader, that's the way to do it. That's what Mrs. Roosevelt did. And then finally, when she would go to events, she would always keep moving. I mean, literally keep moving. So when she would go to an event, she would try to work it so that she didn't have to sit down someplace, but could work the way and work the room and walk through because she knew that the minute she stopped, everybody would glom onto her. And so, in order to meet the most people, in order to have the most impact, in order to gain the most ideas, rather than, that one guy that just sits there and talks your ear off at every meeting, she would keep moving. So it was difficult for people to keep up with her. And if they really, were moving, if she was moving, she was engaging new people all the time and getting new ideas and working her way across that way. All these tools, all these methods, all these techniques, all these turning points turned into our gal, Eleanor Roosevelt, First Lady of the United States and First Lady of the world. Oops. Phone ringing here. Let me just out of the area. Let me just get rid of that. Sorry about that. And here is a political cartoon that shows just how in awe everybody was. So here are the angels, and down at the bottom it says, oh, it's her. So even the angels were impressed, according to this political cartoon, when Mrs. Roosevelt showed up there uh, in the afterlife. So, an incredible person, right? I think you can see why she's one of my favorite people of the 20th century, and certainly a role model for all of us, right? You get knocked down, you get back up, right? You find a roadblock, you find a way around it. You see where you are, take cause with what you have, and then work toward a better future and a better place for tomorrow. Um, I just want to finish up by reading a two paragraphs from a eulogy that was given for her when she died by Adlai Stevenson. He said, "There was no sick soul too wounded to engage her mercy. There was no signal of human distress from which she did not view as a personal summons. There was no affront to human dignity from which she fled because the timid cried danger. And the number of occasions on which her intervention turned despair into victory, we may never know. Her life was crowded, restless, fearless. Perhaps she pitied most not those whom she aided in the struggle, but the more fortunate who were preoccupied with themselves and cursed with the self-deceptions of private success. She walked in the slums and ghettos of the world, not on a tour of inspection, nor as a condescending patron, but as one who could not feel complacent while others were hungry, and who could not find contentment while others were in distress. This was not sacrifice. This, for Mrs. Roosevelt, was the only meaningful way of life. And I don't think anybody could sum it up better than that. Open it up to some questions, comments, snide remarks.
Thanks, Jeff. That was great. Really is a great inspiration. So if you have questions, just please put them in the Q&A, and Jeff will try to answer them.
Oh, thank you, Wendy. And hello, Karen. Little notes in the chat.
Chat, yes.
So if you're looking for, in these terrible times in which we live, these last, 20 years or so, with all this crazy pandemics and economic turmoil and all the rest of it. There are people out there that you can turn to and look to as great inspirations who faced troubles as great as ours and were able to overcome them and find ways of helping people and, making themselves feel better where they were where they were when they were there and while they could. You can't maybe save everybody, but you can save somebody. And Mrs. Roosevelt believed in that very wholeheartedly, and took herself to task in order to be able to do that. So, very very much worthy of admiration, in my opinion.
There's a question about what were Eleanor's views on the Cold War.
Eleanor's views on the Cold War. Eleanor views on the Cold War were that she was not a fan of the Cold War, of course. She was not a fan of the way that Russia was behaving. And she certainly was not a fan of the fact that that both the United States and the Soviet Union had weapons and methods to destroy not only each other, but all of humankind. And she was very taken aback by the fact that the Soviets after the war, really began to sort of backpedal on some of their statements and their actions and their promises toward being a more open and free society. So if you read her My Day columns, she speaks a lot about the tensions during the Cold War and the need to get people together at the United Nations to talk about things, to work things through, not necessarily to, convince the other person that you're right and they're wrong, but to find ways through because, what was at stake, people's lives, people's livelihoods, humanity, was far more important than two separate, political ideologies.
We have another question about how other first ladies have viewed Eleanor Roosevelt. Did they look to her for inspiration?
Yeah,
Nobody's been quite like her, but have others looked to her as a model?
that's a wonderful point, Tammy. People often say, "Oh, Eleanor Roosevelt changed the role of First Lady. Oh, she changed it." I don't think that she necessarily changed it, but she showed what it could be. And it has never been, and this is not a crack against any First Ladies, but none of them have ever been as involved and as active as Mrs. Roosevelt was. Now, you got to be fair, right? She was 12 years as First Lady, so she had a longer horizon and such to do it. But if you think about it, right, each First Lady since Eleanor Roosevelt has kind of picked a topic that they kind of focus on, right? Literacy, obesity, mental health, women's health, whatever it is. Mrs. Roosevelt had a half a dozen issues she was working on at any given time, at least a half a dozen. So I think what she showed was that, the role of First Lady, which is a ceremonial role, right? There's nothing in the Constitution that says anything about a First Lady. We get a First Lady because we happen to have a president who has a wife. So she has no official designation in the federal government, but that doesn't mean that she can't be a force. Doesn't mean she can't be an influence. It doesn't mean she can't be an advocate for issues and concerns, facing people in the country or people in the world. So I think every First Lady since then has been very wise in the fact of saying, well, I can't be another Eleanor Roosevelt, but what I can do is I can focus on one or two key things for our administration, and that's what each of them have done since that time, which I think is very wise, actually.
Another question about Eleanor's friendship with Mary McLeod Bethune. Can you talk a little bit about that and how they worked together on civil rights?
Sure, absolutely. They were very good friends. They were both educators, and that was sort of their bond. They were both social advocates, which was also their bond. And they were when the New Deal began to take place and become be put into place, there was actually some unintended consequences against the African American community. And so Mary McLeod Bethune, obviously was an advocate for these sorts of things. And because she was buds with Mrs. Roosevelt and Mrs. Roosevelt was First Lady, she was able to use that connection and that influence to help shape some changes in the New Deal programs. Now, Mary McLeod Bethune was appointed to first the National Youth Administration, the NYA, and she was very instrumental in that, which was helping to get jobs for young people, especially African American young people. And because she was in the administration, one of the things that President Roosevelt did was he appointed more African Americans into government positions in the government than any president prior to that. So he was bringing the Black voice into the administration. But Mary McLeod Bethune took it one step further and said, okay, we got these these voices all over the government. But if I poke like this, that kind of hurts, right? And it kind of makes an impact. But if I take all of this and I do it with one big well force, that's going to have a bigger impact. So she organized a group that was called the Black Cabinet. And she basically said, hey, it's great that we have all these voices here, but we need to speak as one voice. And so Mrs. Roosevelt was very sympathetic to that. They had a conference at the White House on issues of race, and they worked really to help turn the tide on some of the unintended consequences that had occurred from the implementation of some of the New Deal, opening it up to more African Americans, and reversing or limiting some of the policies that had been hurting them. So their friendship and their partnership and their work, cannot be understated.
Another question is on whether or not Eleanor had a connection with the Society of Ethical Culture.
Society of Ethical Culture. I can't say as I know. It does not ring a bell. I mean, she was involved in so many things. I wouldn't doubt it, but I can't say for sure. Stump me on that one.
And we have also a question of during those years when Eleanor was out, keeping Franklin's name alive before he was elected governor, how was his absence explained? Was it known that he was recuperating or?
Everybody knew he had polio. That was not a secret. Everybody knew he had polio. Time magazine talked about it. He had birthday balls every year where they would have these big parties to raise money for infantile paralysis research and such. So the way that it was explained was that, Franklin wanted to be here tonight, but he's so busy, and he's got some issues with mobility. So he asked me to be here tonight, So it was sort of just brushed aside that way. He wanted me to share this with you. He asked me to be here for this. So they didn't get into big explanations. And the fact that wow, here's Eleanor Roosevelt, that's pretty cool. She's pretty damn, impressive in and of herself. And she's speaking for this guy, Franklin Roosevelt. So that's the way they were able to get away with it. And, the press was far less intrusive in those days. So, you were less likely to be, hounded about it or pressured about it. The unwritten rule was that you didn't show the president looking disabled, right? And he downplayed his disability, right? He didn't hide it, but he downplayed it. And the reason for that was he wanted people talking about what he could do, not about what he couldn't do. Right? Okay, I can't stand by myself. I can't walk to the other side of the room, but I can create an agricultural adjustment act that's going to save farmers, or a civilian conservation corps that'll take all your 18 and 24-year-olds, 18 and 24-year-olds out of your house and out onto a farm and, doing good work out here or there. So he was always trying to push what he could do, not what he couldn't do.
Don't see any more questions. One last chance, anybody?
Going once, going twice.
All right, well, thank you very much, Jeff. That was really interesting. I learned a lot about Eleanor that I did not know before, and I'm sure others did as well. For those of you who are interested, Jeff will be back in April. I believe it's April 12th, maybe. It's also a Monday, talking about baseball and the presidency. And then in May, he will be back to talk about Franklin Roosevelt as a hobbyist. So you get 2 more opportunities to learn a little bit more about Franklin Roosevelt.
So thank you all for having me. And remember, you're not so far away that you can't get down and visit our presidential library, in person. And, if you haven't been there in quite a while, come on down. We've always got new stuff going on, and we'd love to have you come on down in person.
We do have museum passes through the Columbia County Libraries, so you can even go for free. So thanks again, Jeff. We'll see you next month. Bye-bye.
Hey guys, have a good one. Bye-bye.